They laughed at his painting, but they didn't see what he saw. The fluorescent lights of the school gymnasium hummed a flat, indifferent note, casting a pale, utilitarian glow over the cacophony of color and youthful ambition. Cardboard signs, their edges softened by eager, slightly sticky fingers, were taped haphazardly to the bleachers, proclaiming Grade 4 art or welcome to our masterpieces. The air, thick with the scent of popcorn from a distant stall and the faint, sweet tang of drying tempera paint, vibrated with a nervous energy. My own breath felt tight in my chest, a familiar clenching I'd come to associate with these public displays of vulnerability, his, and by extension, mine. Leo's painting, The Whispering Wall, hung slightly crooked on a portable display board at the far end, near the emergency exit, almost an afterthought. It was a swirl of deep indigos, fiery oranges, and unexpected flashes of emerald green, unlike anything else in the room. Where other children had rendered recognizable flowers, houses, or smiling suns, Leo had poured onto his large sheet of thick paper a vision that was entirely his own. It was abstract, yes, but that word, as it was being muttered nearby, felt like a dismissal, a polite way of saying incomprehensible or wrong. A knot of parents, Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson among them, stood a few feet away, their heads tilted. A soft chuckle escaped Mrs. Gable. "Oh, that's very abstract, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying easily in the echoing space. Mr. Henderson nodded, a smirk playing on his lips. "My Sarah tried something like that once. We encouraged her to, stick to things people understand." Their words, though not directed at me, pricked like tiny needles. I saw Leo, standing a little straighter than usual, his small shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on his creation. He wasn't looking at the people, wasn't acknowledging their hushed comments. His pride, so new and fragile, was a palpable thing, a quiet light emanating from him. He glanced at me then, just a quick, darting look, seeking, what? Reassurance? Permission to still feel that pride? I tried to offer a small, encouraging smile, but my lips felt stiff. Then, a boy from his class, Ethan, a known instigator of playground dramas, sauntered past. He paused, looked at the painting, and then, with exaggerated movements, mimed wild, uncontrolled brushstrokes in the air, his face contorted in a theatrical mockery. His friends snickered. Leo didn't flinch. He remained still, his hands clasped behind his back, his chin slightly elevated. But I saw the faint tremor in his stillness, the subtle tightening of his jaw. My heart ached. This place, his art, was supposed to be his sanctuary, the one arena where the usual rules of conformity didn't apply, where his unique way of seeing the world was celebrated, not scorned. I held my breath, the fear a cold stone in my stomach. I'd seen this look on his face before, a quiet retreat inward when the world proved too harsh, too unyielding. I prayed this wouldn't be another moment that chipped away at his precious, nascent confidence. The memory surfaced, unbidden, of Leo a few months prior, kneeling on the cracked paving stones of our back patio. He wasn't playing with his cars or digging in the dirt. He was utterly still, his head cocked, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. I'd watched him from the kitchen window, drying a plate, a familiar worry stirring. He was often lost in these moments of quiet observation, seeing things that passed the rest of us by. "What's so interesting, sweet pea?" I'd asked, stepping out into the cool morning air. He pointed his small, paint-stained finger, always pain under those nails, no matter how much I scrubbed, at a patch of weathered concrete near the old drain pipe. "The colors, Mama," he'd whispered, his voice hushed with reverence. "Look." I'd knelt beside him, my gaze following his. At first, I saw nothing but gray, stained stone. But then, as I adjusted my focus, allowing myself to see through his eyes, the subtle variations emerged. There were faint blues where the rainwater had pooled and dried, almost a periwinkle. Patches of muted ochre, like dried mustard, where moss had once clung. A network of fine, spidery cracks held a darker, charcoal gray, and in one tiny chip, a surprising fleck of rust red, almost like dried blood. "It's like a map, Mama," he'd said, his eyes shining. "A secret map of stories. The wall whispers them." That was the genesis of the Whispering Wall. He'd come inside, his face alight with purpose, and rummage through his box of art supplies, a motley collection of half-used paint tubes, stubby crayons, and brushes with splayed bristles. He hadn't asked for guidance, hadn't looked for approval. He'd simply begun, translating that intricate, overlooked patch of concrete into a landscape of emotion and color. Back in the echoing gymnasium, the art teacher, Mrs. Davies, a kind woman with gentle eyes and flour permanently dusting her apron, approached Leo. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's a very energetic piece, Leo," she said, her smile a little strained. "You certainly have a vivid imagination." She looked at the surrounding, more conventional artwork, then back at his. "Next year, perhaps we can explore some different techniques? Maybe something a bit more representational?" Her words, meant to be encouraging, I knew, felt like another subtle push towards the comfortable, the known. I saw Leo's shoulders droop, just a fraction, before he straightened them again. He nodded politely at Mrs. Davies, but his eyes, when they met mine again, held a flicker of doubt. My own past pressed in on me, a suffocating blanket of remembered shame. I was back in my own fourth-grade classroom, Mrs. Crabtree, with her sharp nose and even sharper tongue, holding up my drawing of a fantastical, winged creature. "And what, pray tell, is this supposed to be, Eleanor?" she'd asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The snickers from my classmates had burned my cheeks. I'd mumbled something about a dream, and she'd sniffed. "Dreams are for sleeping, dear. In art, we draw what is real." I'd never drawn another winged creature. I'd stuck to lopsided apples and poorly proportioned stick figures, my imagination retreating into the shadows. The fear that Leo would suffer the same fate, that his unique spark would be extinguished by well-meaning corrections and peer group ridicule, was a constant, gnawing companion. It was why I'd always tried to create a space for him at home where his creativity could roam free, untethered by expectation. Our kitchen table was perpetually covered in newspaper, splattered with paint, littered with scraps of paper and mysterious constructions of glue and cardboard. The smell of turpentine and drying clay was as familiar in our house as the sin of baking bread. I remembered the days he'd spent working on the Whispering Wall. He'd set up his easel, a wobbly, second-hand affair I'd found at a garage sale, in the corner of the living room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing around him. He'd worked with an intensity that was almost unnerving in a child his age. There was no hesitation in his movements, no second-guessing. He'd squeeze colors directly onto the paper, sometimes mixing them there, sometimes letting them collide and mingle in unexpected ways. He'd use brushes, his fingers, even the edge of a piece of cardboard, lost in his process. He hummed a tuneless little song, a melody only he could hear. One evening, I found him sitting on the floor, just looking at it. The painting was propped against the sofa, vibrant and wild. He had indigo paint smeared across his cheek and a streak of orange in his hair. His fingernails were caked with a rainbow of dried colors. "What do you think, Mama?" he'd asked, his voice small, his eyes wide and earnest, searching my face. It was the eternal question of the artist, young or old. Is it good? Is it worthy? I knelt beside him, truly looking, trying to push past my own ingrained notions of what art should be. I saw the raw energy, the intuitive sense of balance in the seemingly chaotic composition, the surprising harmony in the jarring colors. More than that, I saw him. I saw his courage, his willingness to put his unique vision onto paper, to share the secret whispers of the wall. "I think it's magnificent, Leo," I'd said, and the relief that washed over his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. It's you." And it was. That was the terrifying, wonderful truth of it. When the time came to choose a piece for the school art fair, Leo hadn't hesitated. He'd carefully carried the Whispering Wall downstairs, his brow furrowed with the seriousness of the task. I'd felt a pang of apprehension. "Are you sure, sweetie?" I'd asked, my voice betraying my anxiety. "It's very bold. Some of your other drawings are lovely too, the ones of the trees in the park. They were safer, more conventional, more likely to be understood, to be praised." He looked at me, his gaze unwavering. "This is the one, Mama," he'd said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is the one that matters." And so, here it hung, slightly askew, a vibrant declaration of his inner world, absorbing the muted ridicule and the polite dismissals. I wanted to snatch it down, to shield him, to tell him it didn't matter what they thought. But I also knew that this was his battle to navigate, his courage to own. My role was to stand by, a silent witness, a hopeful anchor. The murmur of the crowd swelled and subsided around us. Children tugged at their parents' hands, pointing at brightly colored macaroni necklaces and lopsided clay pots. Teachers circulated, offering encouraging words. The overall atmosphere was one of cheerful, if slightly forced, appreciation. But the corner where Leo's painting hung felt isolated, a pocket of unspoken judgment. Then, a woman stepped away from the main flow of traffic, her movements unhurried, deliberate. She wasn't a parent I recognized, nor did she have the slightly frazzled air of a teacher at the end of a long week. She was dressed simply in dark, well-cut trousers and a soft gray cashmere sweater. Her silver hair was styled in a chic, understated bob, and she wore glasses with thin, elegant frames. There was an air of quiet authority about her, a certain focused intensity in her gaze as she scanned the displayed artwork. She paused briefly at a charming watercolor of a kitten tangled in yarn, offering a small, appreciative nod. She lingered a moment longer before a surprisingly sophisticated charcoal sketch of a tree, done by one of the older children. My heart began to thump a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. She was moving closer to Leo's end of the hall. I saw her notice his painting. She stopped. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. The ambient noise of the gym seemed to fade. I was aware only of her stillness, of Leo's rigid posture beside his work, and of the frantic thumping of my own heart. Was this to be more criticism, perhaps more elegantly phrased, but criticism nonetheless? I braced myself. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing directly in front of the whispering wall. Her eyes scanned the canvas, moving slowly from the deep indigo depths to the fiery orange explosions, lingering on the unexpected flashes of green. I could see her pupils dilating slightly behind her lenses. She wasn't just looking, she was seeing. A small smile touched the corners of her lips. It wasn't a polite smile or a condescending one. It was a smile of genuine interest, perhaps even recognition. The handful of parents who had chuckled earlier, Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson included, had fallen silent, their attention drawn by the woman's focused appraisal. Even Ethan, the boy who had mocked Leo's brushstrokes, seemed to sense a shift in the atmosphere, his playful smirk fading into a look of curiosity. The woman turned, her gaze sweeping the immediate vicinity until it landed on Leo. He stood very still, his eyes fixed on her, his earlier bravado replaced by a kind of solemn anticipation. "Is this yours?" she asked, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the low hum of the gymnasium. It wasn't loud, but it carried a certain resonance. Leo swallowed, then nodded, a small, jerky movement. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was barely a whisper. The woman smiled again, a warmer, more open expression this time. "It's an extraordinary piece of work," she said. She gestured towards the painting. "Tell me, what inspired you?" Leo hesitated, then his gaze flickered to me, a quick, questioning look. I gave him the smallest of nods. He turned back to the woman. It's a wall in my backyard," he began, his voice gaining a little strength. "It has all these colors, from the rain, and where things used to grow. And the cracks, they look like they're whispering stories." The woman listened intently, her head nodding slightly. "The whispering wall," she murmured, looking back at the painting. "Aptly named. You have a remarkable eye for detail, for the beauty in the overlooked." She looked back at Leo. "And what about these colors?" "They're very strong, very emotive." "They're the colors I saw," Leo said simply. "And the colors I felt. The wall feels old and new at the same time. And a little bit secret." The woman's smile deepened. "It does indeed." She paused, then asked, her voice gentle but direct, "Is it for sale?" The question hung in the air, sharp and crystalline. A collective intake of breath seemed to ripple through the nearby onlookers. Mrs. Gable's jaw, which had been set in a polite smile, dropped slightly. Mr. Henderson blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Mrs. Davies, who had been hovering nearby, looked utterly astonished. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. For sale? People didn't buy paintings at the fourth-grade art fair. Not like this. They bought raffle tickets for a class quilt, perhaps, or paid a few dollars for a lumpy ceramic their child had made. This was different. Leo looked stunned. He glanced at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. "Yes," he said, his voice clearer now. "Yes, it is." The woman reached into her handbag and pulled out a slim leather checkbook and a pen. "And how much are you asking for this remarkable piece?" Leo looked completely lost. He hadn't thought about a price. I hadn't thought about a price. This was meant to be an exhibition, a sharing, not a commercial transaction. He looked at me again, his expression pleading for guidance. Before I could even formulate a thought, the woman spoke again, her tone kind. "Perhaps we can discuss that. What matters is the art itself." She turned to a nearby table where Mrs. Davies kept a small cash box for any incidental sales of craft supplies. "Do you have a standard price for student work, or is it up to the artist?" Mrs. Davies, flustered, stammered, "Oh, well, no, we don't usually." "I mean, $20? Is that She looked helplessly from the woman to Leo. The woman smiled graciously. I think, for a piece of this caliber, we can do a little better than that. She uncapped her pin. What is your full name, young man? Leo Maxwell, he said, his voice gaining a surprising steadiness. She wrote carefully in her checkbook. Then she tore out the check and handed it to him. Leo took it, his eyes wide as he looked at the amount. I couldn't see it from where I stood, but his gasp was audible. Thank you, Leo Maxwell, the woman said, extending her hand. Leo, after a moment's hesitation, reached out his small, paint-stained hand and shook hers. It was a formal, almost adult gesture, and it seemed to solidify the unreality of the moment. You have a unique vision, she said, her gaze serious and kind as she held his hand. A rare gift. Don't ever let anyone persuade you to paint like someone else. The world has enough copies. It needs more originals like you. She released his hand and turned to Mrs. Davies. My name is Annalise Morrow, she said, offering a card. I'm a curator with the Fletcher Gallery downtown. I'd be very interested in seeing more of this young artist's work in the future, perhaps for our Emerging Artists program. A stunned silence descended upon our little corner of the gymnasium. Curator. Fletcher Gallery. The names meant little to Leo, I was sure, but they resonated with the adults. The Fletcher was one of the most prestigious contemporary art galleries in the city. The hushed whispers started then, a ripple of disbelief and dawning respect spreading outwards. The laughter had long since stopped. The smirks were gone, replaced by expressions of shock and, in some cases, a sheepish discomfort. Ethan, the boy who had mocked Leo, was staring, his mouth slightly agape. Leo didn't gloat. He didn't puff out his chest or cast triumphant glances at his detractors. He simply stood there, holding the check in one hand and Ms. Morrow's card in the other, a quiet, almost solemn dignity about him. A small, genuine smile touched his lips, a smile of pure, unadulterated validation. It wasn't the smile of someone who had proven others wrong, but of someone who had been truly seen. Ms. Morrow then turned her attention back to the painting. Now, about getting this safely transported, she said, looking at Mrs. Davies. Do you have anything we could use to protect it? Some bubble wrap, perhaps, or at least some clean paper. Mrs. Davies, still looking somewhat dazed, nodded quickly. Yes, of course. In the art room. I'll get it right away. She hurried off, her sensible shoes squeaking on the polished floor. As Ms. Morrow waited, she spoke quietly to Leo about his use of texture, the way he'd layered the paint, her questions specific and insightful, treating him not as a child, but as a fellow artist. The other parents and children watched, mesmerized. The entire dynamic of the room had shifted, pivoted on this one quiet, unexpected transaction. Mrs. Davies returned with a roll of brown craft paper and some tape. With surprising reverence, Ms. Morrow and Mrs. Davies began to carefully wrap the whispering wall. Each fold of the paper, each piece of tape, seemed to underscore the painting's newfound importance. It was no longer just a child's bright, strange creation hanging crookedly on a display board. It was something valuable, something cherished. When it was securely wrapped, Ms. Morrow tucked it carefully under her arm. She gave Leo one last warm smile. It was a pleasure meeting you, Leo. Keep painting. Keep listening to those whispers. And then, with a polite nod to me, she was gone, her departure as quiet and understated as her arrival. The silence she left behind was thick, charged. Then, slowly, the whispers grew louder. Classmates, who moments before had been indifferent or openly mocking, now looked at Leo with a new curiosity, a touch of awe. Teachers exchanged stunned glances. Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson were conversing in urgent, hushed tones, their faces flushed. Leo turned to me, his eyes shining. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and slipped his small, paint-stained hand into mine. His grip was firm, confident. I squeezed back, a wave of emotion, relief, pride, an overwhelming sense of love, washing over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. The fear that had been my constant companion loosened its grip, replaced by a quiet, profound joy. He had faced the ridicule, stood by his truth, and in the most unexpected way, his truth had been affirmed. We stood there for a moment, hand in hand, the murmur of the gymnasium a distant hum. The fluorescent lights no longer seemed so harsh, the taped-up signs no longer so haphazard. Everything felt sharper, imbued with a new significance. They laughed at his painting, but they'll never forget it now.